Dear viewers, prepare yourselves for a gripping tale of mystery and espionage, brought to you exclusively on the Curious Case channel. Narrated by Dr. Rami, this thrilling story is set in a world where secrecy is power and betrayal lurks behind trusted doors. The vanishing cipher unravels in a post-war era, where nations race to secure their military intelligence, and a single stolen document could alter the balance of global power forever. The story takes you deep into a web of deception, where every shadow conceals a secret, and every ally may be a hidden foe. This intense narrative, woven with political intrigue and high-stakes treachery, showcases the brilliant storytelling that keeps mystery lovers on the edge of their seats. Now brace yourselves as we dive into a tale that will leave you questioning everything you know. A note arrived by urgent dispatch. Detective Alistair Graves scanned its contents, his sharp eyes narrowing as he absorbed the weight of the words. The message was brief, but charged with urgency. Without hesitation, he turned to his trusted companion, Evelyn Moore. "We leave at once. Hawthorne Manor awaits." The mere mention of the estate sent a chill through Evelyn. Owned by Lord Winslow Harrington, a figure shrouded in political influence and controversy, the estate had long been a fortress of secrets. The two investigators wasted no time, stepping into a waiting car that roared into the misty night. As the vehicle tore through the countryside, Evelyn turned to Graves. "Why now? Why the urgency?" He exhaled, eyes locked on the dark road ahead. "Because a document has disappeared, one that should never have existed in the first place." Silence settled between them as the weight of his words sank in. Arriving at the manor, they were ushered inside, where Lord Harrington stood waiting, his presence commanding, his demeanor tense. Beside him was Admiral Langley, a hardened naval strategist whose name alone inspired respect and fear alike. "Detective Graves, we're out of time," Harrington said grimly. "The cipher is gone." A beat of silence, heavy and ominous. "Then let's hope we're not already too late," Graves replied, his voice a whisper against the storm raging beyond the grand windows. "It is absolutely imperative that this loss remains a secret. If word of this theft reaches the wrong ears, the consequences will be catastrophic. I will explain everything as concisely as possible." The weekend had been carefully planned. Only a select few were invited to Blackthorn Hall. Among my guests were Admiral Langley, his wife, and their son Charles. Also present was Evelyn Cavendish, a woman well known in elite London circles, whose presence added a touch of glamour to the otherwise strategic meeting. The evening had been uneventful, or so we thought. The ladies retired early, around 10, and Charles followed shortly after. The Admiral and I, however, had business to discuss, matters concerning a classified naval project of utmost importance. I instructed my secretary, Mr. Alistair Drake, to retrieve the documents from the safe, a set of highly classified blueprints detailing the framework of a prototype naval vessel. As we strolled along the west terrace, savoring the crisp night air and the glow of our cigars, I recall catching a glimpse of movement, a fleeting shadow slipping past the French doors of my study and vanishing into the darkness beyond. At the time, I dismissed it. My secretary was inside. There was no reason for alarm, but looking back now, that was my first mistake. We finished our smoke and returned to the study through the same French doors. Just as we stepped inside, Drake entered from the hallway, his face composed, his hands still adjusting the papers. "Everything is set, sir," he assured me. I nodded, moving towards my desk, expecting to see the plans among the arranged documents. But as my eyes scanned the desk, I felt an immediate gnawing unease. Something was wrong. I rifled through the sheets quickly, my pulse beginning to quicken. "Drake, where are the plans?" I asked, my voice sharper than I intended. He frowned, stepping closer. "They're right on top, sir. I placed them there just moments ago, but they weren't." The crucial blueprints, the very reason for this meeting, had vanished. The realization hit me like a hammer blow. My eyes met Drake's, and for the first time, I saw something there I didn't like. Uncertainty, disbelief, perhaps even fear. We upturned every document, searched the desk, the safe, even the floor, but the result remained unchanged. The documents were gone, stolen, and it had happened within an impossibly short window, no more than 3 minutes, the exact time it took for Drake to step out and return. My mind raced. Whoever had taken them had executed the theft with calculated precision, slipping in and out unseen, leaving no trace, which meant only one thing: the thief was still among us. Why did he leave the room? Detective Alistair Graves asked sharply, his keen gaze locking onto Lord Harrington. Exactly what I asked him. Admiral Langley interjected, his voice edged with impatience. Lord Harrington exhaled, rubbing his temple as he recounted the moment in question. Just as Mr. Drake finished arranging the documents on my desk, a sudden piercing scream echoed through the hall. It was unmistakably a woman's voice. Alarmed, he rushed out to investigate. On the grand staircase, he came upon Miss Elise Fournier, Mrs. Cavendish's French maid. The girl was visibly shaken, her face pale as chalk, and she swore, rather dramatically, I might add, that she had seen a ghost. A ghost? Evelyn Moore raised an eyebrow, skepticism evident in her tone. Indeed, Lord Harrington continued, his voice laced with mild disdain. She described it as a tall spectral figure draped in flowing white, gliding silently across the corridor. Of course, Drake dismissed her claims as nonsense, told her in no uncertain terms to stop being foolish, and returned here. And it was precisely at that moment that we entered from the terrace. Graves folded his arms, his sharp mind piecing together the puzzle. It seems rather convenient, doesn't it? A perfectly timed distraction, drawing Drake away from the study for just long enough. The real question is, was the maid a terrified bystander, or was she in on it, creating the diversion for her accomplice? His voice dropped lower, deliberate, and was the accomplice already inside, or waiting in the shadows? The room fell into heavy silence. Lord Harrington hesitated. I don't know, he admitted. The only thing I saw was a fleeting shadow crossing the terrace. A man, I presume. Graves pressed. Harrington hesitated again. I can't say for certain. It was just a shadow. A sudden unmistakable snort cut through the tension, drawing all eyes toward Admiral Langley. His weathered face held a look of utter disbelief. Graves turned to him, a knowing glint in his eyes. You disagree, Admiral? Langley scoffed, shaking his head. I didn't see a damn thing, and neither did Harrington. He might have imagined it, a branch swaying, a trick of the light, but now that the papers are missing, he's convinced himself he saw someone slipping away into the night. He leaned forward, his voice a low rumble. Mark my words, Graves. This wasn't some spectre wandering the halls. Someone was here, someone with a purpose, and they were faster, smarter and bolder than any of us anticipated. A slow, knowing smile crept onto Graves' face. Then I suppose it's time we find out who. Lord Harrington's lips pressed into a thin line. Perhaps my imagination did play tricks on me, he admitted reluctantly, but I don't believe I conjured it out of thin air. Admiral Langley scoffed, folding his arms across his chest. Imagination's a funny thing, Lord Harrington. It can twist the truth without you even realizing it. I've spent a lifetime at sea, seen men swear they spotted ghost ships on the horizon, or mermaids in the waves, only for it to be a trick of the light, or their own nerves getting the better of them. His voice grew firm, resolute. I was looking straight down that terrace when you claim this shadow moved. If there was something or someone there, I would have seen it. His conviction was unwavering, and it irked Harrington. Before either could argue further, Detective Alistair Graves moved toward the large French windows, his movements smooth and deliberate. If we're debating what was seen and what wasn't, perhaps it's time we put theory to the test. He pulled a small but powerful electric torch from his coat pocket. If you'll permit me, he asked, though he had already stepped onto the terrace. The night was crisp, the scent of damp earth lingering in the air. Graves swept the beam of light along the stone pathway, then onto the freshly trimmed grass that bordered it. He moved carefully, methodically, scanning every inch of ground, his brow furrowed in concentration as he advanced further, the silence thickening around them. Where exactly did you see this figure, Lord Harrington? Graves asked without looking up. Harrington pointed, roughly opposite the window. It moved quickly, straight across the terrace toward the hedges. Graves continued his meticulous search, following the path where the supposed intruder should have walked. The torchlight flickered over the grass, revealing its lush rain-soaked surface. He bent down, studying the damp earth beneath his gloved fingers. Minutes passed. Then Graves straightened up and clicked off the torch. He turned to the group, his expression unreadable. "Sir Harry was right. And you were wrong, Lord Harrington." The silence was deafening. Admiral Langley's face broke into a triumphant grin. "Ha! Knew it. Trust my eyes anywhere." Lord Harrington looked visibly unsettled. But I saw what you saw," Graves interrupted smoothly. "Was nothing." His voice remained calm, but there was an undeniable finality to it. "The ground is damp from the heavy rain earlier this evening. Anyone who had crossed this terrace, anyone would have left clear footprints, but there are none, not a single mark." Admiral Langley let out a satisfied grunt. "Well, that settles that, doesn't it? No phantom figure, no shadowy intruder, just nerves playing tricks." But Harrington still looked unconvinced, his mind struggling to reconcile what he had believed with what he was being told. Graves stepped back inside, closing the French doors behind him. "Which brings us to the people inside this house," he said, his voice taking on a new edge of calculation. "If no one crossed the terrace, then that means the thief was already here." He folded his arms. "Now tell me, Lord Harrington, while Mr. Drake was occupied with the maid, could someone have slipped into this study from the hall?" Harrington hesitated, then shook his head. "No, impossible. He was standing right there. Anyone coming from the hall would have had to pass directly by him." Graves studied him for a moment, then asked the question that made the room go still. "And Mr. Drake himself, are you sure of him?" The atmosphere shifted. The Admiral's victorious air faltered slightly, and Harrington's eyes widened just a fraction. For the first time, the true weight of suspicion settled over the room, and in the heavy silence that followed, the real mystery began to take shape. Lord Alloway flushed deeply. "Absolutely not, Detective Graves. I will vouch for my secretary with complete confidence. It is utterly impossible that he had any involvement in this affair." Graves raised a single brow, his expression unreadable. "Impossible." He let the word hang in the air before adding with a hint of dry amusement, "It seems, my lord, that everything tonight is impossible. Perhaps the plans simply grew a pair of wings and flew away. Comme ça." He pursed his lips and exhaled in an exaggerated puff, mimicking a cherub blowing a kiss. Lord Alloway frowned, his patience wearing thin. "The entire situation is impossible," he said with restrained frustration. "But I must insist, Graves, that you abandon any notion of suspecting Fitzroy. Just think, if he had wanted to steal the plans, wouldn't it have been far easier for him to make a tracing of them rather than risk outright theft?" Graves nodded approvingly. "Ah, my lord, now that is an excellent point. It is evident that you possess an orderly and methodical mind." His sharp eyes glinted. "England is fortunate to have you." Lord Alloway, caught off guard by the sudden praise, cleared his throat awkwardly. The detective, however, was already moving on. "You mentioned that you and the Admiral spent the evening in the drawing room before stepping out onto the terrace." "Yes," Alloway confirmed. Graves turned slightly, eyes narrowing as if seeing beyond the walls. "That room also has a terrace-facing window, does it not?" "Yes, but what of it?" Then Graves said smoothly, "Is it not conceivable that someone exited through the drawing-room window, slipped into this study while Fitzroy was briefly absent, and then escaped the same way?" The Admiral, who had been silently stewing, now scoffed. "Preposterous. We'd have seen them." "Not necessarily," Graves countered. "You were walking along the terrace with your backs turned, were you not?" The Admiral hesitated, exchanging a glance with Alloway. "Well, yes, but Fitzroy was only gone a few minutes, the time it took us to walk to the end of the terrace and back." Graves shrugged. "That's more than enough time for a skilled intruder." He folded his arms. "Like it or not, gentlemen, it is a possibility, perhaps the only one that fits the facts as they currently stand. But there was no one in the drawing room when we left," the Admiral insisted. "They could have entered after you stepped out," Graves pointed out. Alloway slowly exhaled, his mind piecing it together. "You're suggesting," he said carefully, "that when Fitzroy heard the maid scream and rushed out, someone was already hiding in the drawing room waiting. The moment Fitzroy left, They slipped into the study through the windows, stole the plans, and then returned the same way. They only left the drawing room once Fitzroy had returned to this room, ensuring no one would catch them in the act. Graves smiled faintly. Precisely. A silence fell over the room as the weight of the deduction settled upon them, and for the first time that night, the mystery began to take a truly sinister shape. Detective Graves inclined his head slightly, a small knowing smile playing at his lips. "Ah, the methodical mind once again, Lord Alloway. You have a talent for clear reasoning." Lord Alloway exhaled, his fingers tightening slightly around the armrest of his chair. "But that still leaves us with the question, who?" Graves turned, pacing slowly. "Perhaps one of the servants." His tone was neutral, but his sharp gaze flickered toward Alloway, gauging his reaction. "Or," Alloway said, his voice quiet yet weighted, "a guest." The room seemed to grow colder. It was Mrs. Conrad's maid who screamed. Graves continued, tapping a thoughtful finger against his chin. "Tell me, milord, what exactly can you say about Mrs. Conrad?" Lord Alloway hesitated, choosing his words carefully. "I told you that she is well known in society. That much is true. She throws lavish parties, she is seen everywhere, and yet," his voice trailed off as he leaned forward slightly, "very little is known about where she truly comes from. Her past is a mystery." Graves tilted his head. "Intriguing. And tell me, where does her interest lie?" Alloway sighed, as though reluctant to admit it. "She frequents diplomatic and foreign office circles. She seems particularly drawn to those with influence, knowledge, access." Graves narrowed his eyes. "And the Secret Service? They," Alloway admitted, "are asking the same question you are." A slow, satisfied smile crept onto Graves' face. "Fascinating. And you invited her here this weekend. Why?" The weight of the question hung between them. "To observe her," Alloway admitted, "up close." "Parfaitement," Graves murmured, his fingers brushing against the fabric of his lapel. "But it seems, milord, that she may have turned the tables on you rather neatly." A muscle in Alloway's jaw tensed. The thought unsettled him. "Tell me," Graves continued, "was there any mention, any hint of the discussion you and the Admiral were to have that evening? Anything that may have piqued her curiosity?" Alloway hesitated for only a fraction of a second, but Graves caught it. "Yes," Alloway finally admitted. "Sir Harry, rather carelessly I might add, said something to the effect of, 'And now for our submarine.'" "To work." Graves raised an eyebrow. "And Mrs. Conrad?" "She had left the room, or so I thought." Graves stilled. "She returned," Alloway continued, his voice quieter now, as though only just realizing the implications. "For a book," she said. The silence that followed was suffocating. Graves allowed the moment to stretch, to settle, and then he smiled. "How very convenient." Graves nodded, his sharp eyes gleaming in the dim glow of the study. "I see, Lord Alloway, time is slipping away, and this is an urgent matter. If we are to unravel this before the night swallows all traces, I must question every member of this house party immediately." Lord Alloway hesitated only a moment before nodding. "It can be arranged, of course. The difficulty lies in keeping this discreet. We mustn't allow unnecessary alarm or gossip." He glanced towards Sir Harry, then added, "Lady Juliet Weardale, and young Leonard. There's no concern there. But Mrs. Conrad, if she is not involved, questioning her too forcefully could be complicated." Graves tapped a thoughtful finger against his lips. "Understood, milord. Then we shall phrase it delicately. We will not reveal the nature of what is missing, only that an important document has disappeared. No mention of its significance, no hint of the circumstances under which it was taken." "Exactly my thoughts," Alloway agreed. Sir Harry let out a gruff chuckle. "No harm in a little secrecy, eh? After all, even the best of wives talk," Graves interjected smoothly, his lips quirking. "It is the nature of things." Sir Harry nodded. "No offense taken. Women talk, God bless 'em. Though I sometimes wish Juliet would talk a little more and play bridge a little less, but that's how they are these days. Always dancing or gambling." He exhaled, rubbing his chin. "Shall I wake her and Leonard, Alloway?" "Yes, and I will summon the French maid," Alloway replied. already heading towards the door. Graves will want to see her, and she can wake her mistress. I will also send Fitzroy along first. Minutes later the study door opened, and Mr. Fitzroy stepped in, a thin, pale young man with pince-nez, and an expression as cold as marble. He carried himself with an air of distant efficiency. He inclined his head slightly in greeting before settling into a rigid stance before the detective. Graves studied him, then asked, "You were the last person in this room before the theft was discovered. Your statement aligns precisely with Lord Alloway's, but I wonder what is your own theory, Mr. Fitzroy?" Fitzroy adjusted his pince-nez, his expression unreadable. Undoubtedly, it was someone familiar with the house, someone who understood the layout, the movements, and the opportunities that would arise. Graves nodded, but his gaze remained fixed on Fitzroy, searching for something beneath that frigid exterior. A well-calculated risk then, a calculated certainty, Fitzroy corrected smoothly. This was not an opportunist crime. It was planned by someone who knew precisely what they were looking for. Graves leaned forward slightly. "And who, in your opinion, fits such a profile?" Fitzroy's lips pressed into a thin line. The air in the room thickened. "A better question," he said at last, "is who doesn't?" A slow smile spread across Graves' face. "Now we're getting somewhere." Fitzroy exhaled sharply, adjusting his pince-nez with a measured precision. Whoever it was could see everything through the window, waiting for the perfect moment. "The second I stepped out, he slipped in. A pity Lord Alloway didn't give chase immediately when he saw the figure leave. Perhaps this mystery would already be solved." Graves said nothing to correct him. Instead his sharp gaze narrowed, shifting in an entirely different direction. "Tell me, Mr. Fitzroy, do you believe the French maid's story, that she saw a ghost?" Fitzroy's lips tightened in mild disdain. "Hardly, Graves. You don't expect me to entertain such nonsense, do you?" "I mean," Graves pressed, leaning forward slightly, "do you think she truly believed what she saw?" Fitzroy hesitated for a fraction of a second before answering. "I can't say for certain. She certainly appeared distressed, clutching at her head as though in some kind of delirium." "Aha!" Graves exclaimed, eyes alight with discovery. "Interesting indeed. And she was without doubt a rather pretty girl, was she not?" Fitzroy's expression darkened slightly, his voice turning cool. "I didn't notice particularly." Graves tilted his head, watching him closely. "And her mistress, you did not see her?" "As a matter of fact I did," Fitzroy admitted after a pause. "She was standing in the gallery above the stairs, calling out, 'Leonie,' but the moment she saw me, she withdrew." Graves' brows furrowed. "Upstairs," he murmured, as if placing a mental pin on the detail. Fitzroy's lips pressed together before he added, "Naturally I realize that all of this puts me in an uncomfortable position, or would have, had Lord Alloway not witnessed the intruder himself. Regardless, I would prefer to settle any suspicion at once. If it pleases you, I insist that you search my room, and myself." Graves arched an eyebrow, his mind clearly racing with possibilities. He opened his mouth to reply, but before a word could escape, the door swung open. Lord Alloway stepped in, his face composed but his eyes sharp with expectation. "The ladies and Mr. Leonard Weardale are waiting in the drawing room," he announced. Graves straightened, adjusting the cuffs of his jacket with a deliberate gesture. The air in the room crackled with tension. "Then let us not keep them waiting," he said smoothly. "It is time to see who flinches first." The women sat poised in their elegant negligees, a stark contrast to the tension crackling in the air. Mrs. Conrad, a striking woman of 35, possessed golden hair that shimmered under the soft glow of the chandeliers. There was an undeniable charm about her, though a slight fullness in her figure hinted at an indulgent life. By contrast, Lady Juliet Weardale, though still beautiful, carried the weariness of time. Tall and dark, her gaunt frame and restless demeanor betrayed an unease that was difficult to ignore. Her hands, long and delicate, twisted together as though grasping at some unseen thread of control. Beside her sat her son Leonard, a fragile-looking young man whose refined features and pale complexion seemed an odd inheritance from his hearty, boisterous father. Graves delivered his carefully constructed explanation, masking the true gravity of the situation behind a veil of polite inquiry. Then, with a keen glint in his eyes, he turned first to Mrs. Conrad. "Madam, if you would be so kind as to recount your movements last night, precisely as they occurred." Mrs. Conrad gave a slow, deliberate nod, as though assembling the pieces of memory in her mind. "Let me see. I went upstairs and rang for my maid, but when she did not come, I stepped out into the corridor to call for her. I could hear her voice drifting up the stairs, though I couldn't make out her words. When she finally arrived, she brushed my hair, though I must say, she was dreadfully on edge. Her hands trembled the entire time. I dismissed her quickly, read for a short while, and then went to bed." Graves nodded, making a note of her words before shifting his attention to Lady Juliet. "And you, milady?" Lady Juliet hesitated, then spoke in clipped tones. "I went straight upstairs and to bed. I was very tired." A soft melodic laugh cut through the air. "What about your book, dear?" Mrs. Conrad interjected smoothly, tilting her head with a smile that did not quite reach her eyes. Lady Juliet stiffened. "My book? Yes, darling. The book you went to retrieve from the drawing room," Mrs. Conrad said sweetly. "Surely you remember." A flush of color crept up Lady Juliet's cheeks, her fingers curled together in her lap. "Oh yes, I did go down for a book. I have forgotten." Graves studied her keenly. "Forgotten? Or hoped it would be forgotten? Did you hear the maid scream, Lady Juliet?" A pause, too long, then no. "No, I didn't." Mrs. Conrad blinked in feigned surprise. "How curious, because you must have been in the drawing room at the time." The room fell into silence. Every eye turned toward Lady Juliet, watching, waiting. "I heard nothing," she said again, this time with steely resolve. But Graves saw it, the tension in her shoulders, the way her breath had quickened just slightly, a single thread in a tangled web, one that he intended to unravel, strand by strand. Poirot turned his sharp gaze towards young Leonard, who had been slouched in his chair, arms crossed in feigned nonchalance. "Monsieur?" Poirot prompted. Leonard barely lifted his chin. "Nothing doing. I went straight upstairs and turned in." Poirot studied him, his fingers lightly tapping against his sleeve. There was an air of careful indifference about the young man, a reluctance that was more deliberate than natural. But Poirot let it slide, for now. He sighed, shaking his head in theatrical disappointment. "Alas," he murmured, "I fear there is nothing to help me here." His gaze swept over the assembled guests. "Mesdames, monsieur, I regret infinitely to have disturbed your slumbers for so little. Accept my deepest apologies, I pray of you." With his usual flourish of apologetic gestures, he ushered them from the room, bowing slightly as they departed. Lord Alloway and Witherdale left alongside the ladies, murmuring amongst themselves. As soon as the door closed behind them, Poirot turned swiftly, his manner changing from affable host to sharp interrogator. The French maid stood before him now, a striking young woman with bright, impudent eyes and a mouth that hinted at mischief. "Now, mademoiselle," he said briskly, "let us have the truth. Recount to me no elaborate histories. Why did you scream on the stairs?" The girl's lips parted, her lashes fluttering as though caught between hesitation and defiance. "Ah, monsieur, I saw a tall figure all in white." Poirot silenced her with a quick shake of his forefinger. "Did I not say no stories?" He paused, tilting his head. "Let me make a guess. He kissed you, did he not? Miss Leonard Weardale, I mean?" The maid hesitated for only a moment before a slow, knowing smile curved her lips. She gave a small shrug, as if to say, "And what of it?" "Eh bien, monsieur," she said. "And after all, what is a kiss?" Poirot allowed himself a small chuckle. "Under different circumstances, most natural. I myself, or Hastings here," he gestured grandly, "might understand such an innocent moment. But mademoiselle, tell me exactly what occurred." She sighed, a playful glint still lingering in her eyes. "He came up behind me suddenly, like a shadow. He startled me. I screamed. If I had known, I would not have cried out, but mon Dieu, he was silent as a cat." She smirked slightly, then added, "Then came Monsieur Fitzroy." Poirot's brow lifted. "Ah, and what then?" Miss Leonard fled up the stairs. She shrugged again as if it were all a harmless game. And what could I say, especially about a young gentleman commissar, so well-mannered, so respectable? Her voice dripped with amusement. Ma foi, I invent a ghost. Poirot chuckled, his eyes twinkling with satisfaction. And all is explained, he declared warmly. Then his tone shifting to casual curiosity, he asked, "Tell me, mademoiselle, your mistress, where is her chamber?" She gestured towards the far end of the hall. "It is at the very end, monsieur, that way, directly above the study," Poirot murmured, a flicker of thought passing over his face. He nodded to himself, tucking that detail away for later. He straightened, giving the girl an approving nod. "Bien, mademoiselle, you have been most helpful. I shall detain you no longer." She curtsied, flashing him one last cheeky smile before disappearing down the hall. Poirot remained still for a moment, deep in thought. A ghost that wasn't a ghost, a woman retrieving a book she had forgotten, a young man who fled the moment he was seen. The pieces were beginning to take shape, but the full picture remained just out of reach. "For now, and la prochaine fois, do not scream," Poirot said, a twinkle of amusement in his eye as he handed the French maid out of the room. As the door clicked shut behind her, he turned back to me, his mustache twitching ever so slightly in satisfaction. "An interesting case, is it not, Hastings? I begin to have a few little ideas." "Et vous?" I frowned, pacing the room in thought. What was Leonard Weardale doing on the stairs? I muttered, "I don't like that young man, Poirot. He's a thorough young rake, I should say." Poirot's expression remained unreadable. "I agree with you, mon ami. Fitzroy seems an honest enough fellow," I continued, still thinking aloud. "Ah, and Lord Alloway is certainly insistent on that point," Poirot noted, his fingers lightly tapping against his sleeve. And yet, I hesitated, turning back to him. There is something in his manner, précisément, that is almost too good to be true. "No?" Poirot gave a knowing nod. "I felt it myself. A man too anxious to appear without suspicion, often it is a sign of guilt. On the other hand," I said darkly, "our friend Mrs. Conrad is certainly no good at all." Poirot tilted his head. "And her room is directly over the study," he mused, watching me with that sharp gaze of his, always evaluating, always 3 steps ahead. I tried to gauge his thoughts. Could she have? But Poirot only shook his head with a small smile. "No, mon ami. I cannot bring myself to believe that the immaculate Mrs. Conrad climbed down a chimney, or dangled from a balcony in the dead of night." I was about to protest when the door suddenly opened. To my great surprise, Lady Juliet Weardale slipped into the room, her dark eyes darting nervously from side to side, as though fearful of being seen. Her pale hands clutched the edges of her robe tightly, and she exhaled unsteadily before speaking. "Poirot," she said, slightly breathless, "can I speak to you alone?" Poirot steepled his fingers together, his expression unreadable. "Milady, Captain Hastings is as my other self. You may speak before him, as though he were a shadow on the wall, a thing of no account." She hesitated, then seemingly deciding she had no choice, she sat down, still keeping her gaze locked onto Poirot as if measuring his reaction. "What I have to say is rather difficult," she admitted, her voice low. "You are in charge of this case, are you not?" Poirot inclined his head slightly. Lady Juliet hesitated again before continuing, her voice barely above a whisper. "If the papers were to be returned, would that end the matter? I mean," she swallowed hard, "could it be done without questions being asked?" A heavy silence settled over the room. Poirot's sharp eyes locked onto her, his mind already racing ahead of her words. I could sense it. This was no longer just a case of missing papers. There was something more, something deeper, and Lady Juliet knew exactly what it was. Poirot leaned forward slightly, his sharp gaze fixed on Lady Juliet. His voice, though soft, carried an unmistakable weight. "Let me understand you, madame. The papers are to be placed directly in my hands. And I am to return them to Lord Alloway on the strict condition that he asks no questions about their origin." She bowed her head in silent confirmation. A delicate tremor ran through her fingers as they clutched the arm of the chair. "That is exactly what I mean," she murmured, "but I must be certain. There will be no publicity." Poirot's expression darkened. "I do not believe Lord Alloway is particularly eager for publicity," he said grimly. Her shoulders relaxed slightly, and for the first time a flicker of hope danced in her eyes. "Then you accept?" she asked quickly. Poirot held up a hand, stopping her. "A moment, milady. That depends entirely on how soon you can place those papers in my possession." She hesitated, her breathing shallow. Almost immediately, Poirot's eyes flickered to the clock on the mantelpiece. He studied its hands for a moment, then asked, "How soon exactly?" A pause, a barely perceptible swallow, then in a whisper, 10 minutes. Poirot inclined his head. "Decorde, milady. I accept." She rose abruptly, her skirts rustling as she turned toward the door. Without another word, she disappeared into the dimly lit corridor. As soon as she was gone, I let out a low whistle and folded my arms. "Well, that was rather interesting, wasn't it?" Poirot turned to me, an amused gleam in his eyes. "Come now, Hastings, let us see if your little grey cells have been wired. Sum up the situation for me." "Bridge," I said succinctly. Poirot chuckled, nodding approvingly. "Ah, you recall the careless words of Monsieur the Admiral. What a memory you have, my friend. Je vous félicite." There was no time for further conversation, for at that moment the door swung open again. Lord Alloway entered, his expression expectant. He glanced between us, then fixed his gaze on Poirot. "Have you made any further progress in Poirot? I must admit, the answers to your inquiries have been rather disappointing." Poirot stood up smoothly, dusting off his sleeves as though the matter had already been settled. "On the contrary, Miller, they have been quite illuminating." He straightened his cuffs and looked Alloway squarely in the eye. "It will be unnecessary for me to remain here any longer. With your permission, I shall return to London at once." Alloway blinked, clearly taken aback. But what have you discovered?" His voice was tinged with disbelief. "You mean to say, you know who took the plans?" Poirot inclined his head slightly. "Yes, Miller, I do." The silence in the room thickened. Alloway drew in a sharp breath. "Then tell me, if the papers were returned anonymously, you would not pursue further inquiry?" Poirot's expression did not change, but his gaze hardened ever so slightly. "Do you mean upon payment of a sum of money?" Alloway shook his head hastily. "No, I mean, unconditionally returned." A slow, knowing smile curved Poirot's lips. "Bien. Then I would strongly advise you to accept such an outcome." His voice was measured but firm. "Only you, the Admiral, and your secretary are aware of the loss. Only you need know of the restitution. Let the matter end there." Alloway's brow furrowed. "I don't understand." Poirot spread his hands. "There is no need to understand, Miller. You came to me with a problem. I have solved it. You have the answer you desired. Let the burden of the mystery rest upon my shoulders." He smiled faintly. "If anyone asks, simply say that Hercule Poirot has restored the papers. Nothing more." Alloway studied him for a long moment, then exhaled slowly. "The recovery of the plans is the most important thing," he admitted. His voice was softer now, more contemplative. "Very well, I shall take your advice." Poirot nodded approvingly, and extended his hand. "Miller, it has been a pleasure to make your acquaintance. I have faith in you, and in your devotion to England. You will guide her future with a strong and steady hand." Alloway clasped his hand firmly. "In Poirot, I swear to you that I will do my utmost." He paused, then added, "It may be a fault, or it may be a virtue, but I believe in myself." Poirot gave an exaggerated shrug, his moustache twitching with amusement. "Mais oui, so does every great man." He tapped his own chest grandly. "Me, I am the same." And with that the case, at least for Poirot, was closed. The car rolled up to the entrance in a matter of minutes. Lord Alloway, ever the statesman, bid us farewell on the stone steps with renewed warmth. His handshake was firm, his expression resolute. As we drove away, Poirot leaned back against the seat, his gloved hands resting lightly on his cane. He exhaled thoughtfully before speaking. "That is a great man, Hastings," he declared. "He possesses intelligence, cunning and authority. England needs such a man to lead her through these turbulent days of reconstruction. I watched the stately figure of Lord Alloway recede into the distance. I'm quite prepared to agree with you, Poirot, but tell me, what about Lady Juliet? Is she to return the papers to Alloway directly? What will she think when she realizes you've left without a word? Poirot chuckled softly, a glint of mischief in his eyes. Ah, Hastings, you are asking the wrong question. The real question is, why, when she stood before me, did she not hand over the papers then and there? I frowned. She hadn't brought them with her. Exactly, mon ami. Now consider this. If they were merely in her room, how long would it take her to retrieve them? A minute? 2? Yet she requested 10. Pourquoi? Clearly she had to obtain them from someone else. And not just obtain them, Hastings. She had to reason, perhaps even argue, before they were surrendered. A chill crept into my spine. Then that means she was covering for someone. Poirot nodded. Now why? Not Mrs. Conrad, this I am sure of. No, it must be a member of her own family. Her husband? Unlikely. Her son? Far more probable. Leonard Weardale, I muttered. He claimed he went straight to bed, but we both know that's a lie. Just so. Poirot tapped a finger to his temple. Imagine Hastings. His mother searches for him, finds his bed empty. A mother's instinct fills her with dread. She fears the worst that her son, desperate, reckless, has taken the papers himself. And then when she does find him, she hears him boldly lie, claiming he never left his room. Voila! She leaps to the natural conclusion. Her son is the thief. The carriage wheels clattered over the cobblestones, as I considered his words. It makes sense, Poirot. But there's one problem. Leonard couldn't have stolen the papers. He was on the staircase, whispering sweet nothings to the French maid. Precisely, mon ami. Poirot's expression darkened. Lady Juliet does not realize it, but her son has an alibi. He may be a rogue, but he is not this particular rogue. I swallowed hard. Then who? I ran through the list in my head. Lady Juliet? Emma Mrs. Conrad. Emma Mrs. Conrad. The maid? No. We've eliminated everyone. Poirot's gaze sharpened. Have we? He leaned forward slightly, his voice dropping to a whisper. Think, Hastings. Fitzroy leaves the study. The plans remain on the desk. A few minutes later, Lord Alloway enters. He approaches the desk, and suddenly the plans have vanished. A strange creeping realization began to take hold of me. You're saying there were only two possibilities. Exactement. Poirot's eyes gleamed with satisfaction. Either Fitzroy never left the papers on the desk at all, but that is absurd, because if he wished to steal them, he could have done so in secret at his leisure. Or, he let the word hang in the air, savoring the moment. I felt my breath hitch. Or the papers were on the desk when Lord Alloway entered. Poirot nodded, his voice dropping to a whisper. In which case, Hastings, the papers did not vanish. They simply moved, from the desk to Lord Alloway's own pocket. The truth crashed over me like a wave. A shiver ran down my spine. Lord Alloway, the great man, the patriot, the one who had sought Poirot's help, the thief. I stared at Poirot, but he only smiled, pressing a finger to his lips. A great leader, but a desperate man is capable of desperate things. The case, it seemed, was not quite over yet. Lord Alloway, the thief.
Yes.
I'm scarcely able to believe my own words. But why, Poirot? What could possibly drive a man of his stature to such an act? Poirot's eyes gleamed in the dim glow of the carriage lanterns. He steepled his fingers, tilting his head slightly, as if savoring the puzzle in his mind. My dear Hastings, he said smoothly, do you not recall the whispers of scandal that once clung to his name? You told me yourself. There was an inquiry, a shadow cast over his career, yet in the end he was exonerated. Poirot's voice lingered on the word. But what if, mon ami, what if the accusations had been true all along? A chill passed through me. You mean he was guilty, but it was covered up? In English public life, Hastings, there must be no scandal, Poirot said gravely. Reputation is everything. If such an indiscretion were to resurface now, if proof were to emerge, then poof, his political career would be over in an instant. And so we must consider, what if Lord Alloway was being blackmailed? What if the price of silence was the submarine plans? I felt my stomach twist in disgust. Then the man's a traitor, I burst out, selling his own country's secrets to the enemy. But Poirot merely shook his head, a knowing smile touching his lips. Ah, Hastings, you always see in black and white. Non, Lord Alloway is neither a fool nor a villain. He is resourceful. Imagine this, mon ami. What if he had no intention of truly betraying his country? Suppose instead, he devised a clever trick, one worthy of a man in his position. I stared at him. A trick? Poirot nodded. Yes, Hastings. Suppose he did copy the plans, but being an engineer of no small skill, he introduced the slightest, most imperceptible alterations, each one making the design subtly flawed, completely useless in practice. He hands over these faked plans to the enemy's agent, Mrs. Conrad, I strongly suspect, but in order for them to be believed, the theft must look authentic. It must seem as though the plans were stolen from right under his nose, so that no suspicion arises. The weight of realization pressed down on me. So the entire thing was staged. Precisely. Poirot snapped his fingers. First he allows Fitzroy to leave the study, ensuring there is a perfect window for the supposed theft. Then he enters, himself, retrieves the real plans from the desk, and replaces them with his carefully altered copies, and to ensure the deception is complete.
Yes.
He plays the part of the victim, even fabricating a sighting of an intruder at the window. But the Admiral, I said slowly, the Admiral insisted no one could have entered that way. Just so. The Admiral's stubborn refusal to believe in Alloway's intruder
meant
that suspicion lingered inside the house. That was never the plan. So Alloway's next priority was to make sure that Fitzroy, his trusted secretary, was never seriously suspected, because if Fitzroy were thoroughly investigated, the entire scheme might unravel. A strange admiration crept into my voice. It's a bold but Poirot, you're basing all this on instinct. There's no solid proof. Poirot smiled knowingly. Ah, mon cher Hastings, you still do not see. A guilty man is reckless. A man handing over genuine plans to an enemy would not care who took the blame. But Alloway, he cared. He was meticulous in ensuring that no innocent party was implicated, and above all he was desperate to prevent Mrs. Conrad from learning the exact details of the theft. Why? Because Hastings, he had already given her the fake plans earlier in the evening. If she realized the so-called robbery had happened at a later hour, she would know she had been deceived. I exhaled, shaking my head. It's brilliant, but are you sure? Poirot's eyes twinkled. I am always sure, mon ami. And as always, he was right. For on the day Lord Alloway took office as Prime Minister, a package arrived at Poirot's door. Inside was a signed photograph, accompanied by a single check. The inscription read, "To my discreet friend Hercule Poirot."
Yes.
From Alloway. In naval circles, there was much celebration over the Z-type submarine. They said it would revolutionize maritime warfare, and I had it on good authority that a certain foreign power had attempted to construct a similar vessel, only to suffer a humiliating failure. To this day I remain convinced that Poirot had been guessing, but I suppose the world will never know. One thing, however, is certain. He will do this once too often, and one day, he may not be right.